Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our panel. I'm welcoming Bill Sienkiewicz at San Diego Comic Fest. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our panelists. This is Dr. Alex Grand, who is the founder and main admin for the Comic Book Historians social media. They have great comic book history on Facebook, Instagram, and their own website, as well as a YouTube channel. My name is N. Scott Robinson, and I'm a professor at San Diego Mesa College. And I'm the founder of the Globo Comico, social media for international comics on YouTube and Facebook. And today we're going to talk about the contributions of Marv Wolfman and Bill Sienkiewicz to American comic book history, and then the dissemination and spread of their work and what that might mean for comics history through the licensing of international editions.
So Marv Wolfman was born in Brooklyn, 1946. He graduated from the New York High School of Art and Design. His first work was originally in the fanzines of the 1960s, and he worked with different genres. One was horror. It was called Stories of Suspense, and that was in the mid-60s. Then there was also a superhero one, the Super Adventures fanzine, and this one is important in that he created the Star, and the Star became Black Nova in issue 6. And this character, Black Nova, had a similar Nova Centurion costume that we all know about, but would later become the Richard Rider Nova in 1976 for Marvel. Now, Marv was both writer and artist, and the reason why that's important is because he was a very visual writer. As far as Wolfman's early career, his first published work was Black Hawk 242, 1968, with art by Pat Boyette. And you can see that cover here on the right. Really beautiful illustration. But he didn't get a writing credit in that one. His first actual pro-writing credit was in Teen Titans 18, 1968, with co-writer Len Wein. And that's shown here on the left. He and Len Wein co-created the character Jericho, which was supposed to be the first DC Black superhero. Unfortunately, the publisher Carmine Infantino changed the character to white just to avoid offending the crowds at the time. In the 1970s, Wolfman co-created the character Destiny with Bernie Wrightson in Weird Mystery Tales 1, 1972. And the reason why that character is important is because Neil Gaiman would use this character in the Sandman series, and you see this character here on the right. Now, in 1972, he moved over to Marvel Comics to work for Roy Thomas, and this is when he started on the Tomb of Dracula with Gene Colan, which was beautiful, a series that lasted 70 issues until 1979, and notably, he created the character Blade in issue 10. A lot of people would consider the work of him writing it, Gene Colan penciling it, and Tom Palmer illustrating it as to be the best issues. Now, he was also editor-in-chief for the Marvel Black and White magazines from 1974 to 1975. And he was also editor-in-chief for all of Marvel Comics and Magazine the year after, from 75 to 76. Now, if you look at his creations, you can see just what a creative dynamo he actually has been all these years. In 1973, like we said, he created Blade. In 1976, he created Daredevil's arch nemesis Bullseye. In 1976, he also finalized the creation of his Nova character that he worked on in the 60s with Richard Rider Nova. And then in 1978, he created the character Morgan Le Fay, which can be seen as a reimagining of the Joe Maneely character from the Atlas 50s era. But this version was the one that was used in the Hulu Runaway Season 3 show. In 1979, he also co-created Terrax the Tamer, and this axe-wielding villain was used a lot in the John Byrne run. And then also in 1979, he created the character of Felicia Hardy Black Cat, which a lot of us take for granted and has been seen in the movies. And it's fun to know that that was a Marv Wolfman creation. Now, in the 1980s, he left Marvel Comics after some editorial disagreements and went back to DC, where he then unleashed even more creations. In 1980, he started up the new Teen Titans with George Perez, and he created Raven, Starfire, Cyborg. He also created the villain Deathstroke in 1980, and this villain is important in that, one, he's a recurring villain in the TV shows, but he's also what Deadpool was based on. Now in 1981, he created the Omega Men. In 1982, he created Night Force, which was a bit of a throwback to the Tomb of Dracula days with Gene Colan, as Gene Colan also penciled this series. And then in 1983, he created Vigilante, an anti-hero that was not afraid to kill people for justice. And what's interesting is that is almost a pioneering step in a lot of the anti-heroes that would be really rocking comics in the later 80s and the 90s. Now in 1985, he also created Monitor, Anti-Monitor, and Harbinger for the Crisis on Infinite Earths limited series. And then in 1989, he created Tim Drake Robin, the third Robin, which was received a lot better than the second Robin that was killed by the Joker with a crowbar by Jim Starlin. Now, in the 90s, his creativity kept going. He created the Scrooge's Quest for the DuckTales comics, which a lot of people love the Scrooge's Quest. In 1991, for Batman, he created Avatar and the Electrocutioner. And then in 1994, he created Man Called AX for independent comics line. And then he ends up evolving toward the animation world, and he's developing the Transformers Beast Machines cartoon. So he was not stuck in comics, he did cartoons as well. Now in the 2000s, 2004, he created the comic Defects. Then in 2006, he starts writing in another style. We talked about cartoons, obviously comic books, but also novelization. So he wrote the novelization for the Superman Returns movie. And in 2007, he wrote Stan Lee's Condor, which was a fun animated series for the Stan Lee Company. And then he was also an editorial director of the 2009 Free Comic Book Day education comic series called Impact University, which was to help kids get more motivated in writing their own comics, which I think is a throwback to his days of working in the fanzines, being a kid, trying to make comics himself, and that inspiring him to work later. I think he was trying to induce this sort of change in kids in the 2000s. Now, in the 2000 teens, he continues to produce. In 2011, the new Teen Titans with George Perez. There was like a lost, unfinished chapter that they finalized. In 2012, he got nominated for a Writers Guild Award for video game writing, which was in the epic Mickey 2, The Power of Two, which was a very popular game with kids. Now, there were more novelizations, and this one kind of fuses the novelization art form with the video game stories, where he wrote the novelization for the Batman Arkham Knight video game. And already there was good storytelling, but he writes a novelization to put it in the correct format and to add more background to the various scenes that we get from the video game. In 2016, he wrote another novelization for the Suicide Squad movie, which was very popular in its time. And then also in 2020, his Crisis on Infinite Earths finally saw a TV show treatment in a 5-episode crossover, which was hugely popular, did really well with fans and ratings. When you see all this and you see this timeline, and he continues to be around today writing and producing and creating new things, I asked him here at the convention, how does it feel looking back at all the stuff you've done? Is it something you're proud of? And he says, I don't really look back much. I just like to look forward and create new things. And I think that just goes to show what a creative dynamo he really is. And this is a scene here from the Crisis on Infinite Earths TV show. And it's fun because he's talking to Supergirl and Flash, who each have their own TV shows. And they're obviously paying homage to Marv Wolfman and his creation of this concept of this series of this type of crossover event. But what's also interesting is those are the two characters he also does kill off in the comic, so he's creator, but also maybe a specter of death, in a sense, in this scene as well.
Okay, so when we talk about the contributions of someone to comics history, we almost exclusively, in American comic books, it's sort of Amerocentric that we talk about their contributions. And, to what scope, do these contributions, like what makes it really popular, really goes out into the world? Well, this is largely the period 1968 to 1990, if we look at some of the examples from just the first 20 years of his career. This is before social media and before the impact of the movies and large-scale merchandising. So it's, I think the international editions of this American work, as they were published all around the world, played a role in not only making his contributions popular, his characters, but really disseminating and spreading his work and ideas about comics in general in many parts of the globe. So if we just look at some of the examples that were shown previously by Alex, we can see that very clearly over just a 20-year period how widespread it is. So the first one here is the Teen Titans 18, an Australian edition, just 1 year after it's come out. And then in Brazil in 1969 as well. That's two totally opposite ends of the world, just a year after his first pro publishing credit. If we continue on with the other book that came out is Black Hawk, once in Mexico in 69. It's a year after, again, the US edition. To continue on, the Tomb of Dracula series, which was very popular, the American issue in 1972, an Australian edition in 1977. The Brazilian edition pictured here is relatively recent. But if we continue along the timeline, more or less, you've got a Danish edition from 73, one in England in 1974, which features a reverse of the artwork, making these international editions somewhat unique. And then in 1982, another Danish edition, followed by editions in Italy in 1973, Mexico in 75, Germany in 74. So you can see it's spreading relatively pretty rapidly in many parts of the world, and this is just looking at an example of one issue. There's obviously a lot more of this material. 1982 Norway and 1988 Spain, 1972 in Sweden, that came out the same year. So it's like this work in just a couple years of him beginning is sort of spreading rapidly pretty far and wide. If we look at a few other examples, this is an Argentine oblong edition from 73, and then a French edition from 75, and another German reprint that's also relatively recent in the 21st century. So it's like just this one issue has had a life of its own in many countries over a 20-year or more period. If we look at some other examples of his work, the iconic Tomb of Dracula 10 with the creation of the character Blade in 1973, who went on to become one of the very first Marvel characters popular in the movies much later. But if we look at the trajectory and dissemination of the spread of this character through Marv Wolfman's work internationally, Canadian edition in French in 1974, a Danish edition in 1973, followed by a French and English editions in 75, German edition in 1974, Spanish edition in 1980, Sweden in 1973, a relatively recent one in Brazil 2018. So this, these issues kind of have a life of their own, and sometimes they just keep coming out in different parts of the world. The other iconic character he created was Bullseye, so the American edition in 76, followed by Scandinavian editions in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway in 1982, just 7 years later. It's sometimes easy to skip over Marv Wolfman's contribution as an editor to Marvel, but not only did he write and create characters, but he also worked on issues as an editor that were iconic and important to comics history. So this is just one example of that. The Avengers 144, which was the first appearance of Hellcat, and then a Philippine edition just 2 years after it came out in America. It's on the other side of the world. The issue that introduced Terrax and Fantastic Four 211 in 1979, right away it's out in France and Canada in 79, a few years later in Italy, followed by the Black Cat's introduction in 1979 in America, followed by simultaneously appearing in English editions in Great Britain, a Finnish edition in 1982, a Greek edition a year later in 83, a very radically colored edition, a Dutch edition in the Netherlands, which is also pretty typical in international editions, that there are lots of variances, not only in the language, but sometimes the coloring or repurposing of the art on the cover. And here's a good example of that from Australia in 1981, where they sort of retitled the comic, even though it's still in English. If we look at some of his work from the 1980s, the New Teen Titans, USA in 1980, a few years later, a French-Canadian edition, followed by an edition in Spain in 1984, the iconic Green Lantern issue, followed by a German edition a year later, and then Night Force, both USA and a year later in France, and then the Vigilante issue from 1983, a year later, a Danish edition, and then his Detective Comics in 1991, the same year, comes out in Brazil. So what does this really mean, all these different editions? Well, what we just see with the few examples that we have shown here today is that Marv Wolfman has had a sustained international exposure of his work in his writing, his characters, and editing in at least 21 countries and 12 languages across North America, Latin America, Europe, Southeast Asia, and Oceania in just over 2 decades. So that's really remarkable that somebody who basically starts off in comics in 1968 could spread that far and wide. So I think the international editions were important in popularizing some aspects of American comics abroad, as well as perhaps disseminating ideas about writing or characterization or art that may have influenced indigenous comic creators to come later.
So now this is the half where we talk about the Bill Sienkiewicz portion of the presentation. And it's nice to get some background, some analysis of his work, where he comes from, what space he comes from. So Bill Sienkiewicz descends from Literature Nobel Prize winner Henry Sienkiewicz. So Sienkiewicz. So a lot of people don't realize that he actually has creativity in the family, award-winning creativity. Bill was born in 1958 in Pennsylvania. He grew up in New Jersey. When he was 4 years old, he grew up on 3 main artists that he loved the most: Kurt Swan's Superman, Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four, and Neil Adams' Batman. These were his 3 major inspirations. He also loved science fiction in general. He read a lot of Jules Verne, and he graduated from the Newark School of Fine and Industrial Arts. His early career, he was a master of many forms, but he first drew like Neil Adams because that's what was popular at the time. And story has it, he showed some Neil Adams type of illustrative work to some of the comics people. I think he spoke to Vince Colletta possibly, who then called Jim Shooter and said, hey, I have someone, actually he pointed him out to Neil Adams over at Continuity, and then Neil Adams called Jim Shooter and said, hey, I got a guy that draws like me. So then he submits some art pages and gets the Moon Knight gig with writer Doug Mensch. And this started out in the Hulk magazine, which then graduated to its own series. And so in this, he starts out in that Neil Adams style of illustrative art, but then it would go to into other directions throughout the series. So when you look at these pages, you see an illustrative approach to the artwork. The muscles are perfect, the postures are perfect. There's a lot of movement. Every muscle has meaning, has function, and some of it is just amazing. I love this splash page of Spirits in the Sand with the guy getting punched right in the head. The look in his face is priceless because he looks about as surprised as you are when you first pull open the cover and see this splash page. It feels like the art punches the reader in the face. But you see, overall, there's an illustrative approach to Moon Knight in the beginning. And if you follow the artwork, you can see that it actually starts off with, on the left, you have that kind of him walking away, and the action, his right foot is larger. there's kind of this foreshortening going on. Then as time goes on, you see there's a more illustrative fighting with that Moon Knight cover with the Mona Lisa in the back, but then all of a sudden the backgrounds start getting a little more interesting. You see that design with the lady in the red dress, but the red blends with the rest of the cover. You see after that he's about to punch a guy, but in the background, there's like a child scribbled pictures. There's some emotion being told. And then, of course, in issue 34, you have almost the psychosis or the multiple personality disorder of Moon Knight really coming to the forefront. And this would actually become more evident with his Legion character that he worked on with Chris Claremont, that has its own TV show as well. But you can see that it's not just him utilizing various artistic concepts on top of the illustration. He also elevated the comic art form. So if you look at these 9-page or these 9-panel grid pages of Kirby action, that's from Fighting American on the left. In the middle you have Captain America. And then you have his Moon Knight, and you have a really cool 9-panel action grid shot of a circular motion. So there's almost a circular time being told, but you also have a feeling of depth where he starts out farther away and is climbing up the building. So there's a sense of space-time motion being told, as well as the nonstop action of the 9-panel action grid. So he does take that kind of Kirby approach to action, but then he takes it to a whole nother level beyond that. And there's some symbolism with the semicircular moon shape of Moon Knight's cape with the movement of him, and that acting almost like its own clock. So the moon showing a bit of a passage of time. This is all interesting in that one page. Now, not only was he great at telling the story, but he also was doing layouts. So look at this 1981 page where he does the layouts of Fantastic Four, not the finished art, but he does the layouts. And you can see that the Human Torch has the right leg closer and the left leg farther. You're kind of right behind the hero in the middle of the action. And that's really similar to going back to that Moon Knight on the left of this picture, where you see that same choreography here, but brought to the Human Torch, and now you're in the middle of the air. So you can see that these layouts, that's a Bill Sienkiewicz layout. And then also his covers. So you have Power Man and Iron Fist. You have, in 1983, the New Defenders. The What If covers are great. And then in 1984, again, this is where the abstract stuff starts coming in. Some expressionism, some of that avant-garde approach to the illustration. You know, like Noel Sickles would black out a lot of the picture to add more emotion. Well, he did the same here with the Hulk. You actually have more black than almost anything on this page, and yet it's able to tell a more emotional feeling of anger, especially with those rays of color coming from the Hulk's hair and eyebrows. This What If the Hulk Went Berserk? This is really showing an interesting mixture of illustration and the expression, the avant-garde approach to art, all in one picture. So 84 is when this stuff really starts to kick off. And of course, as that happens, he starts off in the New Mutants with Chris Claremont, and he brings some of that multiple personality disorder from the end of the Moon Knight series and to the New Mutants with Legion, and you have this feeling of psychosis with this character as well, but it's taken a whole more abstract level. You even see these covers. You can see that you have the New Mutants but they're scared. They feel overwhelmed, so they're depicted smaller on the covers, but then also with this overwhelming fear, enemies coming out of nowhere, all of them trying to reach out and grab them. You can see the uncertainty of being an adolescent, having to deal with some of the enemies that they were dealing with. Then also the character of Warlock with the techno-organic robot was always contorted in weird features, his neck stretched, face enlarged. This almost harkens back to Jack Cole's Plastic Man, but then combined with some of that expressionist art and illustration, kind of a combined feature, which we see him fuse those three things again with Kingpin in a later work we're going to go over. But in ELEKTRA Assassin, you look at these panels, and each one tells its own interesting story. Every page is its own, could be in a museum, all by itself. And the interesting thing is, she's beautiful, like in an illustrative piece, but also sexy, and drawn in a way that it's not blatantly sexual, but it's enough where you're intrigued by what you're looking at. You want to know what's going to happen next. And this art takes you on the ride of the main protagonist. You start questioning the sanity of the protagonist, and you start wondering if what you're seeing is really what the actual story is. It's a great technique, and this he does with Frank Miller. So he's able to work with a lot of great writers, with quite a few great writers in the 80s, but being able to put his own artistic twist in the storytelling. Now, that fusion of for the techno-organic robot Warlock, where you have cartoon, you have like an artistic avant-garde expressionism, almost like a Gustav Klimt painting, and then you also have illustration, all three in Warlock. Well, you have all three in the Kingpin character in the Daredevil Love and War from 1986, and you look at the massive Kingpin with his little head, but he doesn't look goofy. He actually looks like a very physically dominating character. Also, the details are different. There's more of a noir edge to this story, and he's able to bring that into this and be able to adapt to the genre of each character, a totally different feel. Now, taking this noir to another level, there's The Shadow in 1987 that he did some issues with Andy Helfer, and these images are just so much fun to look at because it's a great way for him to get a little more abstract in the artwork. You know, all those ha-has with the bullets. You don't really see the shadow there, but you know what's happening. Same thing also with the interior layouts of the story. He's telling the story. He actually has a close-up of the shadow's face, but you're still not sure what the shadow really looks like. So this is just kind of an interesting technique that he's able to do. Maintain the mystique of the character. Now there are more titles after that. So there's Alan Moore. He also did some work with Alan Moore, brought to light in 1988, which has kind of a shared political manifesto between Moore and Sienkiewicz, talking about Iran-Contra, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Reagan administration. Whether anyone agrees with it or not, it still makes for a really interesting storytelling experience. Big Numbers, 1990, he did a couple issues of that. It was meant to go longer, it didn't work out. But the art is awesome, and of course the writing by Moore is awesome, but you see that same 360-degree approach to the panels, where it starts from the top left and ends on the middle left, just like that Moon Knight page. And he takes that to a more illustrative level here. Of course, you have Classics Illustrated 1991, where he does Moby Dick. Each page is its own painting. It's pretty amazing to make a story like that feel that exciting. He also worked on 30 Days of Night Beyond Barrow in 2007, which he was able to play with the zombie genre. And, you know, to sum it up, he's worked in various media. It's not just comics. Album covers, trading cards, children's books, the biography of Jimi Hendrix, Emmy Award nominations for Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, the Venture Brothers DVD set cover art. He also won multiple awards like the Eagle Award, the Inkpot Award, the Kirby Award, Eisner Award, Inkwell Awards. So he's highly celebrated. His art is used in multiple media. Dr. Robinson is going to go over how that artwork was celebrated and then also licensed in other countries.
All right, so first we'll take a look at his iconic work on the Moon Knight series in 1980. You can see, like, right away, the opposite side of the world. You know, it's out in Australia. A year later, it's in Scandinavia and Denmark, followed by 2 editions in England in the same year. And the Brazilian one's a relatively recent one. France in 83 and 87, 81 in Norway. And what I find interesting about some of these international editions, not only is the spread of the artist's work and what that dissemination might mean, but some of the variances in some of the colors of the background, the less cluttered work of some of the art on a cover like this in Norway, where they've got a completely redesigned logo for Moon Knight, or in this case, Monty Baronin. And then when you see it, the French one, that these have far less clutter on the covers than, say, the British ones or the American ones. It's got all this sort of business information on the cover, UPC codes, prices, the logo of the company, things like that. The international editions are far less cluttered, so if you are someone who appreciates the work of great artists like Bill Sienkiewicz, these are well worth checking out for a number of reasons like that. But to continue on, Spain 1981, Sweden in 1981, another Spanish edition in 2007. So again, this is spreading rather rapidly to a lot of different places outside of America. If we look at some of the other Moon Knight editions, you see a sort of similar pattern in 1981 in America, followed by Danish and English editions in Great Britain in 1981. And again, the variances in some of the fonts. And it's interesting, in some of the international editions, they leave the title in English, and they pair Moon Knight with Conan the Barbarian as a sort of backup feature in this series called Super Marvel. That was even though the cover is in English, the interior is entirely in Danish. A few more examples of this one. Here's the iconic Norwegian one that's got the Mona Lisa in the background. Again, very less cluttered, almost to zoom in on some of the more important aspects of the cover in addition like this. And then the Swedish one, Super Syrian, also in 1981. Then the Moon Knight 24, which we start to see this sort of change in Bill Sienkiewicz's work to the more abstract, with the 1982 original and a year later across 3 Scandinavian countries. The New Defenders, it's got that more painted look to the cover, and this is a Dutch edition from the Netherlands in 1984, which you can see they added a lightning bolt to the graphic up here in the title, and that some of the colors are variant from the printing in the United States. So again, that sort of adds to the appeal of some of these editions, and we also see that his work, like Marv Wolfman, is spreading far and wide pretty rapidly after it comes out. This is the American edition of What If 45 and a Canadian newsstand edition in English this time. And then some of the New Mutants covers, and I'll look at some more earlier editions here than my colleague Dr. Grant had shown previously, but the same type of idea that you've got this iconic mixture of straight artwork and this sort of abstractness start to take over this title with Sienkiewicz's art. So here's the American original from '84, and then an Italian version in 1990. And it's interesting that the UPC code here, it's not used outside of America, so some of the international editions actually use it to advertise backup features or do other interesting things with it on the cover. Here's number 19 with the iconic Demon Bear saga, and this is a trade paperback from Spain in 1995. And then in France in 2012, it's got the same cover, but you notice the title X-Men Classic. Some of the X-Men titles are probably a little confusing for international audiences, so in some places they just tended to call them X-Men and put Excalibur and X-Force and New Mutants and X-Men all in one mag. Now, in the Italian edition in 1990, this is about 4 or 5 years after the original, you see this one is radically colored different with the green and purple fonts on the cover, adding to the kind of exotic appeal of tracking these down. Here's New Mutants 20 from 1984, followed with a Greek edition in 1992. And then the American New Mutants 21 in 1984, followed by a Greek edition in 92, and Italian edition in 1990. And then number 23 with an Italian edition in 1992. And this is number 25 in 85, and 5 years later, the Italian edition. The ELEKTRA Assassin also was published internationally. This is a German edition from 1989, just 3 years after it came out in America. So when you see such iconic work that comes out in America in 1986, we tend to think about, if you're going to chase this down, you go to the back issue market, months after it came out. But some of these issues, it's like that idea of having a life of their own. They're still coming out new in other parts of the world as long as 3 or more years later in some cases. Then some of the last examples looked at is Sienkiewicz's work on the shadow. So here's an edition USA. 4 years later, it's in Spain in 1991. So, what does this mean, this international licensing of Sienkiewicz's work? Well, like we saw with Marv Wolfman, Bill Sienkiewicz has also had a sustained international exposure of his work as an iconic comic artist. In this case, 14 countries, 11 languages in North America, Latin America, and Europe in over 4 decades. So, what does the international licensing mean? Well, with the spread of this work in so many countries and languages, it really helps to spread unique ideas about comics, artwork, writing, characterization. And the spread of those kinds of ideas may influence indigenous comic creators outside of the United States. What's also interesting about this is that the comic creators themselves are not always aware to what extent their work has been licensed and spread internationally by companies that employed them through the work for hire agreement, which was perfectly legal at the time prior to the big movie and merchandise deals that happened in the end of the 20th century. But there was a lot of the artists seemed unknown about that. When I showed Bill Sienkiewicz of Moon Knight 24 from Norway, he was really genuinely surprised and shocked and impressed by how beautiful the work was in a foreign language edition. And he had no knowledge of it some 40 years after it had come out. So thank you all for coming to our panel. If you would like to find out more, you can visit the Comic Book Historian's social media and also Global Comica. We'd love to see you on Facebook and visit our websites. Thanks very much.